May of 2025, 46-year-old Christy Crampton was arrested after a disturbing in-flight altercation with a child who allegedly called her fat and Miss Piggy. The two were returning from a trip to Disney World when the situation suddenly spiraled out of control. Witnesses say Crampton began striking the boy with her fists and a water bottle, even slamming his head against the airplane window. When questioned, she told police the child had been disrespectful and had pushed her arm away before she snapped. One witness told investigators the woman wasn't correcting the child, she was abusing him. Crampton was charged with felony child abuse and released on bond, while the child's identity, relation to her, and condition were not disclosed. Before gunning down Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, his assassin Nathuram Godse had already tried to kill him twice before. In 1944, he led a group that charged Gandhi with knives during a prayer meeting, and later that year, he confronted him again wielding a dagger. Both times he was caught but released. Gandhi, committed to his philosophy of nonviolence and forgiveness, reportedly refused to press charges. That mercy would prove fatal just 4 years later when Godse finally succeeded in his third attempt, firing 3 bullets into the man who preached nothing but peace. Morbid Facts, Part 755. In September of 2013, 26-year-old Tiffany Witten walked into a Walmart in Marietta, Georgia, and was never seen again. Around 2 a.m., she was caught shoplifting and confronted by store security. Panicked, Tiffany kicked off her shoes and bolted out of the store barefoot, leaving behind her phone, purse, and everything she owned. Her boyfriend who was with her stayed behind and gave conflicting stories about what had happened to her. At first, security assumed she'd return for her belongings, but she never did. Several days passed before anyone officially reported her missing. Despite mass searches, tips, and national coverage, no trace of Tiffany has ever been found. On September 25, 1980, Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham drank an estimated 40 shots of vodka in less than 24 hours. He passed out at Jimmy Page's house where he was put to bed but never woke up. The next morning, Bonham was found dead at just 32 years old, having choked on his own vomit while unconscious from the alcohol. His death forced Led Zeppelin to permanently disband, cementing his legacy as one of rock's most tragic losses. In the summer of 1962, Old Yeller author Fred Gibson's family was suddenly struck by tragedy. His son Mike discovered their dog chained up in a shed and brutally clubbed to death, a sight so devastating that he took his own life just a few days later. Not long after, Gibson's marriage also fell apart, while the dog's killer was never identified. Morbid Facts, Part 424. Known for his historically cruel behavior, Roman Emperor Nero accidentally killed his pregnant wife by kicking her to death. He then found a young boy named Sporus who looked exactly like her, castrated him, then married him. Nero would call the boy by his deceased wife's name and dress him in women's clothing, while making his court play along with this disturbing act. The unsettling relationship would come to an end when Nero died in 68 AD, but this was only the beginning of the boy's suffering. For the next 3 Roman emperors, Sporus would serve as a royal sex slave. One of these horrible emperors, named Vitellius, planned on humiliating the boy in a public performance. In the middle of the gladiator games, Sporus would be graped in front of a stadium crowd as a reenactment of the Grape of Proserpina, after which he would be publicly executed. Upon hearing about this sinister plan, Sporus decided to end his own life at the young age of 19. In the early 1930s, New York high society had an unlikely new it girl, a mannequin named Cynthia. Designed by artist Lester Gaba, she was so lifelike that designers dressed her in couture. She was photographed at parties and even received fan mail like a real celebrity. For years, people treated her like she was actually alive. But in 1938, Cynthia toppled from a chair and shattered into pieces, and newspapers reported her death with obituaries, as though a beloved socialite had just passed away. In the early 1980s, Minneapolis was haunted by the weepy-voiced killer, a man who routinely phoned police after his murders, sobbing and begging them to stop him. For years, his trembling voice was the only lead. That changed in 1982 when he lured sex worker Denise Williams into his car and stabbed her 15 times with a screwdriver. But Williams fought back, smashing a glass bottle over his head and escaping. Bleeding and panicked, he later called 911 for medical help, and detectives immediately recognized the same weepy voice from the anonymous murder call. He was identified as Paul Michael Stefani and sentenced to life. Morbid Facts, Part 6. This photo from 1954 shows 2 little Australian boys playing in a sandbox full of asbestos. This was during a time when very little was known about the effects of asbestos on humans, as both boys eventually died from mesothelioma before the age of 40. Our Archaeologists working at the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, Italy, uncovered the remains of a 30-year-old man who appeared to have survived the initial eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, only to be killed when he was struck by a large slab of stone. The lowest form of accommodation in Victorian England was a place where you could dangle over a rope overnight for the price of a penny. For centuries, the feet of Chinese women were tightly bound from a young age as part of a traditional custom, causing the breaking and bending of the toe and foot bones. This resulted in extremely disfigured feet that resembled the hooves of animals. In 1963, two criminal scammers in Mexico convinced an entire village that they were prophets and demanded tribute and worship. They soon paid prostitute Magdalena Solis to imitate an Incan goddess as part of the scam. Suffering from religious delusion, she started to genuinely believe that she was a goddess. Magdalena soon took over the village and started sacrificing her followers and drinking their blood. Morbid Facts, Part 733. This is Kalpana, a 13-year-old domestic worker in Bangladesh who was rescued after enduring unthinkable abuse at the hands of her employers. For months, she was beaten, burned, and even had several teeth forcibly pulled out, leaving her body covered in scars. Her case only came to light when a doctor noticed her injuries and contacted a journalist, who then notified police. The first photo shows her immediately after being rescued, still traumatized and scarred, while the second captures her later in recovery upon finding her smile again. In 2023, 38-year-old Christina Murray from Savannah, Georgia underwent IVF hoping to finally become a mother, only to face one of the most devastating mix-ups in IVF history. After giving birth in December, she was stunned when her newborn son's features didn't match the white sperm donor she had chosen. A DNA test later revealed the unthinkable. The embryo wasn't hers at all. For 5 months, she breastfed, nurtured, and bonded with the baby until a court ruled she had to surrender him to his biological parents. Now separated from the child she carried and cared for, Murray is suing the clinic responsible, describing the ordeal as a nightmare that robbed her both of her dream of motherhood and the son she thought was hers. Matthew McConaughey's father died while getting it on with his mother, and she insisted that his lifeless body should be carried out of the house naked after he was declared dead. Her reasoning was, quote, "I was just so proud to show off my big Jim McConaughey and his gift." Saito Musashibo Benkei was a 12th century Japanese warrior said to have single-handedly killed over 300 trained soldiers while defending a bridge. His combat in close quarters was so incredible that his enemies had to resort to killing him with a volley of arrows, and he died while standing up. In 2015, a Connecticut mother tried to hire a hitman to murder her ex-husband during a battle over child custody and his purported $50 million fortune. She paid the hitman $5,000, but the man instead reported her to the husband, who then told the authorities. She was sentenced to 5 years probation, but despite the attempted murder charge, she never lost custody of her child. Morbid Facts, Part 272. Actor Lane Garrison from Prison Break was the cause of a deadly car crash when he was 26 years old. He picked up two 15-year-olds and a 17-year-old and decided to go to a high school party with them. After providing the girls with alcohol and doing coke, he crashed his car, which fatally killed the 17-year-old. Garrison only served 1.5 years of his 3-year prison sentence before returning to Hollywood. The light penguin on the right is an elderly female, while the darker one is a young male. After they both lost their partners within the last 2 years, biologists have followed them, as they meet together every night to comfort each other and watch the lights for hours. A 95-year-old Chinese village woman named Li Zufang was declared dead when her neighbor found her motionless and no longer breathing. But on the day before her funeral, 6 days later, Li's neighbors were stunned to find her empty coffin. The villagers went on a desperate search to find the body, only to discover the woman casually cooking up a meal in her kitchen. Morbid Facts, Part 271. The death of Alice in Chains lead singer Lane Staley was only discovered when his accountants noticed that no money had been withdrawn in 2 weeks. They told Lane's manager, who then contacted Lane's mother, who then called 911. The 6-foot-tall singer only weighed 86 pounds when his body was found. In 2020, a North Korean mother was sent to jail for choosing to save her 2 children from a house fire instead of saving portraits of North Korea's leaders. Ants can accidentally misinterpret the chemical trails left by other ants and start walking in circles. If too many members join in, it can kill the entire colony in what's known as a death spiral. In 2002, a Chechen terrorist attack at Moscow Theater resulted in the deaths of 130 people, but only one of them was actually killed by the terrorists. The other 129 were accidentally killed by sleeping gas administered by the Russian special forces trying to rescue them. In honor of Jane Goodall, these are the most bizarre and disturbing behaviors ever observed in chimpanzees. In 2008, a chimpanzee from Zambia named Julie was spotted with a strange new habit. She would stick a piece of grass in her ear and just leave it there. It served no purpose for food, grooming, or communication. But soon enough, other chimps in her group began copying her, as researchers eventually realized this was the first fashion statement ever observed in the wild. Lucy the chimpanzee was raised from birth to believe she was a human. She learned to sign over 250 words in American Sign Language, but also picked up some rather disturbing human habits. Lucy developed a taste for gin, spent time flipping through Playgirl magazines, and even used a vacuum cleaner to masturbate. When she became too difficult to control, researchers released her into the wild. But years later, her body was found mutilated, most likely killed by poachers. Azalea the chimpanzee lives in a North Korean zoo and has been known to smoke a pack of cigarettes per day. She's learned to use a lighter and can even light one cigarette with the burning end of another. In Uganda, scientists observed young chimpanzees caring for sticks and rocks as if they were children caring for dolls. They cradled them, carried them into nests, and treated them as if they were babies. The eerie implication is that chimps, like humans, may be capable of imagination and symbolic play. In 1997, a chimpanzee named Santino stunned researchers with his violent planning at a Swedish zoo. Each morning, while calm, he gathered stones and stacked them in hidden piles around his enclosure. Later in the day, when he became agitated, he used those piles to launch surprise attacks on zoo visitors. It was the first clear evidence that an animal had deliberately prepared for future violence. This was the mask worn by 51-year-old Vance Luther Bolter when he posed as a police officer and ambushed Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette at their Champlin home in June of 2025. Dressed in a tactical vest and carrying a flashlight, he knocked on their door in the middle of the night, and the moment Hoffman said, "You're not a cop," Bolter opened fire. Bullets tore through the couple in their doorway. John struck 9 times, Yvette 8, as their terrified daughter Hope hid just feet away while her mother shielded her body with her own. Somehow, both parents survived after hours of surgery, but they were left in critical condition. However, the carnage didn't stop there. Hours later, Bolter stormed into the home of Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman, executing she and her husband Gary as they both slept. Investigators later uncovered that he carried a disturbing hit list, targeting Democratic politicians and abortion providers, revealing the massacre as a carefully planned campaign of political terror, one that left Minnesota shaken to its core. Morbid Facts, Part 740. There's a surgery so incredibly bizarre that's called tooth and eye surgery. Known medically as osteoodontokeratoprosthesis, it's a last resort operation for people with severe corneal blindness. Surgeons remove one of the patient's canine teeth, root and jawbone included, hollow it out, and fit it with a tiny plastic lens. The bizarre implant is first stitched underneath the skin of the cheek for months, where it swells, fuses with flesh, and even grows its own blood supply before it's transplanted into the blind eye. Surgeons describe the moment of implantation as one of the most surreal in medicine, sliding a blood-soaked tooth back out of the cheek and into the empty cornea. The body is far less likely to reject the implant if it's made from the patient's own living tissue, making a tooth the ideal durable anchor. The result is an unsettling image, a tooth visibly embedded in the white of the eye with a lens peeking through like a peephole, but it's restored vision to people thought to be permanently blind, sometimes after decades in darkness. Morbid Facts, Part 741. In August of 2020, 5-year-old Cannon Henent was riding his bike outside of his Wilson, North Carolina home when his 25-year-old neighbor, Darius Sessoms, suddenly walked up and shot him point-blank in the head in front of his 2 sisters. The murder was described as execution style and left the community completely stunned, especially since Sessoms had shared dinner with Cannon's family just days prior. He was arrested within 24 hours and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, receiving life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, no clear motive has ever been revealed. Here's a photo of George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, at a 1967 rally. Rockwell built his movement around hate-filled rallies in open admiration for Hitler. But his end came not at the hands of his enemies. In August of 1967, Rockwell was gunned down outside of a laundromat in Arlington, Virginia, shot twice through his car window by John Patler, a bitter former ally he had recently expelled from the party. The man who preached violence and division was assassinated by one of his own followers, leaving the American Nazi Party leaderless and fractured. In 1968, 20-year-old college student Barbara Jane Mackle was bedridden with the flu in a Georgia motel, unaware that two strangers had been stalking her and planned one of the most sadistic kidnappings in U.S. history. At 4 a.m., there was a knock at the door. A man dressed as a police officer stood outside with a badge, claiming Barbara's boyfriend had been in a serious car accident and was asking for her. But it was a calculated lie. The kidnappers had researched her personal life, knew her boyfriend's name, and used emotional manipulation to get her mother to open the door. The second they stepped inside, the disguise dropped. The man pulled a gun. His female accomplice used chloroform on her mother, and Barbara was tackled to the ground. As they tied her up and dragged her away, they said that if she screamed or fought back, they would kill her boyfriend. Sick, terrified, and believing her silence was the only way to protect him, Barbara didn't resist as they shoved her into a car and drove deep into the woods. There, the kidnappers revealed something even more twisted. They had built a custom coffin for Barbara, just 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 3 feet high, equipped with a dim light, a fan, and water laced with sedatives to keep her weak and compliant. Before sealing the lid, they snapped a Polaroid of her trapped inside, holding a sign that said kidnapped, then buried her alive under the dirt. Alone with the flu in total darkness, Barbara could barely move as the fan buzzed weakly. Insects crawled across her skin, and she prayed that the air wouldn't run out. The kidnappers then contacted her father, Robert F. Mackle, a millionaire real estate tycoon, and demanded $500,000 in cash, one of the largest ransom demands in U.S. history. Despite FBI warnings, her father personally paid the ransom, driving the money himself while federal agents hid in his trunk. But after they took the cash, the kidnappers ran off without revealing where she was buried, leaving the FBI racing to locate a hidden grave in miles of forest while Barbara was slowly suffocating underground. For 83 agonizing hours, she lay buried alive, hallucinating from fear and sedatives. At one point, rainwater began leaking into the coffin and she was prepared to drown. When the FBI finally captured the kidnapper and forced him to talk, agents dug frantically through the dirt until they heard faint knocking from below. They ripped the lid open, and a trembling, dirt-covered Barbara whispered, "You're the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." Her kidnapper, Gary Christ, was sentenced to life but paroled after just 10 years, became a doctor, and was later arrested again for smuggling drugs. Julie Andrews had one of the most iconic voices in Hollywood history, but one botched surgery destroyed it forever. Known for Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, her flawless 4-octane soprano was considered untouchable. But in 1997, a simple procedure to remove harmless nodules went horribly wrong. Surgeons permanently mutilated her vocal cords, leaving her in agonizing pain just to speak. Andrews later sued the hospital and won, but no lawsuit could undo the damage, as the world's most beloved singing voice was silenced forever. This NASA scientist helped land humans on the moon, but his rockets were first built with slave labor in Nazi death camps. Wernher von Braun, the celebrated architect of the Apollo missions, once ran the V-2 rocket program for Adolf Hitler. The rockets were manufactured using prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, who were typically starved, beaten, and worked until they died. Conditions were so brutal that over 20,000 prisoners were killed while making the rockets, far more than the rockets ever killed in combat. But after the war, von Braun wasn't punished. Instead, the US secretly brought him to America under Operation Paperclip, erased most of his Nazi past, and turned him into a national hero. Artifact Porn, Part 34. This 2,000-year-old mummy shows astonishing precision in the linen wrapping around its head, layered so neatly it looks machine-woven rather than done by hand. The unique artifact is the only mummy housed in the Louvre Museum, offering an incredible glimpse into how carefully the ancient Egyptians prepared their dead for eternity. When this Roman mosaic was unearthed in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists realized it had survived an earthquake without cracking, the waves of stone still perfectly frozen in the moment the earth vibrated beneath it. The horse-drawn omnibus of the 1890s was once the most reliable form of transport in city streets. Crowded with strangers and pulled by exhausted animals, it clattered over cobblestones long before the first car horn ever sounded. Czech photographer Miroslav Tishy built his cameras out of trash, cardboard tubes, tin cans, and bits of string. The crude lenses produced blurry, distorted images that looked damaged or decayed, yet he embraced the flaws. Between the 60s and 80s, he took thousands of photos of women in his hometown, turning obsession, imperfection, and voyeurism into an unsettling form of art. Sweden once let the public crawl inside the world's only taxidermied blue whale, a 19th century relic preserved at the Natural History Museum in Gothenburg. Built in 1865, the exhibit was so massive that visitors could walk through its body to view a small museum inside. But in the 1970s, public access was abruptly ended when a couple was reportedly caught having intercourse inside the whale's belly. The wild persona of Tiger King's Joe Exotic was a trail of cruelty even darker than what viewers saw on Netflix. Former employees recalled how he casually shot animals that displeased him, once killing a woman's horse within minutes of her donation and laughing about it before feeding its body to his tigers. He was accused of shooting older tigers in the head to make room for new cubs, animals that drew much bigger crowds and more profit. His zoo's kitchen was piled high with expired Walmart meat, which not only fed the big cats but was allegedly also cooked into pizzas for paying customers. A mysterious fire that destroyed his studio wiped out days of footage that insiders claimed showed him brutally executing animals on camera. Even his music career was a lie. He hired musicians to record songs and then lip-synced over them in his bizarre videos. As his empire collapsed, investigators uncovered a murder-for-hire plot against his rival Carol Baskin and evidence of him killing at least 5 of his own tigers. For all the flamboyance, costumes, and chaos, the legacy Joe Exotic left behind is one of exploitation, cruelty, and death. A man who apparently turned suffering into a spectacle and ended up caged himself.